I had seen blood in places it didn't belong before, lungs, brain tissue, even inside the pericardium, but never in tears. That night, under the dim fluorescence of the trauma ward, I watched a single crimson droplet trace its way down her cheek, shimmering like a ruby caught in motion. It wasn't a nosebleed, it wasn't trauma to the face, it was her eyes. She sat in the isolation bay, shoulders trembling, her pupils fixed on some invisible point far beyond the white walls. I'd read about hemolacria, blood and tears, but usually it came with infection, injury, or a rare tumor. This was different. Her tears weren't tinged pink. They were thick, almost viscous, a deep garnet hue that clung to her skin before falling onto the sterile drape. The monitors beeped with mechanical detachment, utterly unaware of the strangeness unfolding. My gloved hands hesitated before touching her face, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile line between science and something that felt almost supernatural. She didn't flinch, but her breathing hitched, and I knew the story behind those tears would not be a simple one. The nurse whispered to me, "She's been like this since the incident." No one in the ward knew exactly what the incident was, only that she had arrived in shock, her blood pressure dangerously low, and her eyes shedding this impossible crimson grief. Somewhere in the folds of her memory something catastrophic had happened, and her body was broadcasting it in the most haunting way imaginable. I didn't yet know that her condition would defy every textbook I had ever studied. I didn't know that the trauma wasn't only psychological, and that the changes in her blood chemistry would force us to confront the unthinkable. But as her gaze finally met mine, I understood one thing with certainty. This case was going to change me forever. My name is Dr. Aaron Whitfield, and in my 20 years of practicing medicine, I have dealt with traumas that would crush most people. But nothing prepared me for Emily Harrow's case. She was 34, healthy by all measurable standards, until one night, following a devastating personal loss, her tears began to carry a chemical profile no medical journal had ever recorded. When she arrived at St. Alara Medical Center, her vitals were unstable. The EMTs reported no signs of head injury, no visible wounds, and no internal bleeding on preliminary scans. Yet her tear samples revealed elevated hemoglobin levels, a strange imbalance in clotting factors, and a previously undocumented protein structure that seemed to alter the viscosity of the fluid itself. Emily was not a high-profile patient. She wasn't famous, nor the subject of public intrigue, at least not yet. But within days, whispers about the woman who cried blood began circulating in medical circles, drawing quiet visits from specialists in hematology, neurology, and even psychiatry. Some wanted to understand the biology, others wanted to understand the mind. I wanted to understand both. The human body has an extraordinary way of expressing what the mind cannot articulate. In Emily's case, the barrier between emotional trauma and physiological response seemed to have collapsed entirely. Whatever had happened before she walked into my ward had rewritten her biology in ways that would force us to question everything we knew about stress, grief, and the limits of human resilience. This is the story of how we unraveled the mystery of Emily's tears, and how, in the process, I found myself confronting my own beliefs about medicine, trauma, and the invisible threads connecting body and soul. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit that like button and comment below telling us what country and city you're watching from. Emily's first night in the hospital was restless. The soft hum of the oxygen concentrator blended with the intermittent beeping of the cardiac monitor, but she barely slept. Every hour, I or one of the night staff would enter to check her vitals, each time finding her eyes still wet with those unnervingly dark tears. We collected samples in sterile tubes, labeling them with timestamps, hoping that serial analysis might reveal a pattern. By morning, the lab had already flagged her first results as anomalous. The fluid collected from her tear ducts contained hemoglobin levels equivalent to diluted venous blood. Even more peculiar, the osmolarity was significantly higher than normal tears, suggesting an active shift in chemical composition rather than passive leakage from conjunctival vessels. I stood in the lab, staring at the printout, feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. I returned to her bedside, pulling up a chair. "Emily," I began softly, "I know you've been through something difficult, but I need to understand when this started." She hesitated, her lips parting, as if the answer itself carried too much weight. "It began the night I lost him," she whispered, the last two words cracking under the strain. Her pupils trembled, and fresh tears welled, rich, crimson, heavy enough to cling before falling. The chart showed no prior medical conditions, no history of bleeding disorders, no eye trauma. I ordered a full blood panel, coagulation studies, and an MRI of the orbits and brain. The MRI returned clean. No tumors, no vascular malformations, no retinal hemorrhages. That left us with the unnerving possibility that this phenomenon was systemic, tied not to injury but to a biochemical cascade triggered by acute emotional trauma. By midday, word had spread beyond our department. Two hematologists from a nearby research center arrived unannounced, claiming they'd read the preliminary notes in a colleague's email. They wanted to observe her tears in real time, to witness the hemolacria event as it occurred. Emily reluctantly agreed, though she seemed exhausted by the attention. I noticed how her breathing deepened each time she was asked to recount the night of her loss. The coagulation profile deepened the mystery. The prothrombin time and partial thromboplastin time were slightly prolonged, but not enough to explain spontaneous capillary bleeding in the lacrimal glands. Platelet count was normal. Yet, floating in the tear fluid, we found fragments of a protein chain that didn't match any known entry in the protein databases. It was as though her body had manufactured a grief-specific compound, something born in the crossfire between neurology and hematology. During my second evening round, I noticed she was clutching a small silver locket. It was dented, worn at the edges, and inside was a photograph of a man in his early 40s with a kind, easy smile. "My fiancé," she said before I could ask. "We were supposed to get married in 6 weeks." Her grip tightened, and her gaze fell toward the floor. As she blinked, a tear rolled down, viscous, deep red, staining her hospital gown like ink on linen. I began to suspect that her autonomic nervous system had entered a state of prolonged hyperarousal, one that was interfering with normal vascular permeability. Catecholamines, adrenaline, and noradrenaline can wreak havoc on microcirculation. Perhaps, in her, this stress response had uniquely targeted the capillaries feeding her lacrimal apparatus. It was a theory, but it was all I had. I ordered a continuous heart rate variability monitor to track her autonomic activity alongside tear episodes. That night, Emily's condition took a turn. Her tears grew darker, more opaque, and she began to complain of a metallic taste in her mouth. Fearing oral mucosal bleeding, I examined her palate and gums, both clear. The metallic taste, then, was likely from trace iron in the tears themselves, absorbed as they reached the nasolacrimal ducts. It was a bizarre, almost poetic symptom, but one that confirmed the tears' true blood content. By the end of that first 24-hour cycle, we had more questions than answers. The symptoms were stable but profoundly abnormal. The lab work both fascinating and frustrating. Emily had become, unwillingly, the center of a medical puzzle that was as much about her emotional history as her physical state. As I closed my notes that night, I couldn't help but write in the margin, "This is not just biology, this is grief crystallized into blood." The second night brought no relief. Emily's tears came more frequently, each drop heavier than before. The crimson sheen had deepened into something almost black in dim light, as though the iron concentration was rising. She complained of a dull ache behind her eyes, a pressure that worsened with each crying episode. I worried about retroorbital bleeding, but imaging again showed no pooled blood. The source remained maddeningly elusive. Her blood work began to shift in concerning ways. Hemoglobin levels were slowly declining. Not critically yet, but enough to suggest she was losing blood in measurable amounts. The loss wasn't from an external wound, and no internal source appeared on scans. We were forced to face a disturbing possibility. Her tears alone could be contributing to anemia. It was a phenomenon I had never read about in any case study. The hospital staff started whispering. Some avoided her room, unsettled by the sight of thick red tears streaming from otherwise uninjured eyes. Emily noticed the stares, and her posture became more guarded. She spoke less, withdrawing into herself, though occasionally clutching her silver locket as if it were an anchor, keeping her from drifting away completely. I realized her isolation could worsen the psychosomatic components of her illness. Midway through the week, the episodes intensified. She began experiencing epistaxis, nosebleeds, that coincided with crying. This raised the question of whether the tear ducts were drawing in blood retrograde from nasal vessels under abnormal pressure. Yet, even during these nosebleeds, the viscosity of her tears remained unique, thicker than nasal blood, suggesting the altered protein structure persisted. It wasn't just blood mixing with tears, it was something transformed. I decided to bring in a neurologist specializing in autonomic dysfunction. His preliminary impression was that Emily's sympathetic nervous system was in overdrive, possibly stuck in a feedback loop triggered by her initial trauma. If that's the case, he warned, her vascular instability could escalate. We might see spontaneous hemorrhages elsewhere. That possibility weighed heavily on me. The eye region could be just the first visible site. True to his warning, Emily developed petechiae along her upper cheeks, tiny pinpoint hemorrhages caused by fragile capillaries bursting under minimal strain. They appeared after a particularly emotional conversation when a family friend visited and mentioned her fiancé's name. It became painfully clear that emotional stimuli directly influenced her physical symptoms, amplifying both frequency and severity. The hematologists grew increasingly fascinated. One suggested that the mysterious protein chains in her tear fluid might be a modified fibrinogen, altered by stress hormones and inflammatory cytokines. If true, this could explain the abnormal viscosity. They proposed experimental testing, but Emily hesitated to sign consent. She was exhausted, and each additional needle prick or swab felt like another intrusion. Meanwhile, the psychological burden was mounting. Emily confided in me that she had begun dreaming of her fiancé's accident every night, waking up with her pillow stained dark red. The sight terrified her. "It's like my body refuses to let me move on," she said. I reassured her that we were closer to understanding the mechanism, but inside, I feared we were chasing a phenomenon that might never fully reverse. On the 6th night, things reached a crisis point. Emily's heart rate spiked to 140 BPM while she was resting. Moments later, she began crying uncontrollably, her tears now so dark and thick they left streaks like dried paint across her cheeks. Her oxygen saturation dipped slightly, though her lungs were clear. We administered mild sedatives to calm her nervous system, but the event left us shaken. This wasn't just a rare symptom anymore, it was becoming a dangerous systemic event. As I documented the episode, I realized Emily's condition was evolving beyond the boundaries of known medicine. The convergence of grief, neurology, and hematology had created something unprecedented and unstable. We needed a turning point soon, or the weight of her trauma might push her body past a line we couldn't bring her back from. I didn't know it yet, but the breakthrough was coming, and it would come from an observation so subtle most would have missed it. The turning point came on the 8th day, though at first it didn't feel like one. I was in Emily's room during an early morning vitals check when a shaft of winter sunlight angled through the blinds, cutting across her face. She blinked against the light, and for the first time, I noticed that her irises looked subtly different, slightly clouded, as if a thin reddish film had settled over them. I leaned closer. The film wasn't in her cornea. It was on the tear layer itself, refracting the light like stained glass. This small detail sparked a question. If the protein chains in her tears were structurally unique, could they be forming microfilms across the tear surface before gravity pulled them down her cheeks? And if so, what was binding them together so consistently? I asked the lab to examine not just the fluid, but the tear film as a whole, including the upper meniscus along her eyelid margin. The results were staggering. The tear film contained unusually high levels of ferritin, the protein that stores iron in blood. Normally, ferritin levels in tears are negligible, but in Emily's case, they were hundreds of times higher than baseline. This explained the depth of color, but not its origin. The lab's theory, microvascular leaks in her lacrimal gland capillaries, were releasing red blood cells, which were then lysing and liberating iron, where it bonded with proteins altered by inflammatory mediators from stress. This discovery shifted our focus. The condition wasn't purely a bleeding disorder, it was a hybrid process involving vascular fragility, stress-induced inflammation, and aberrant protein chemistry. More importantly, if we could interrupt even one of these pathways, we might be able to reduce the severity of her symptoms. But we needed to know which pathway was driving the others. The neurologist suggested a provocative test: simulate a mild emotional trigger in a controlled setting while monitoring tear chemistry in real time. Emily agreed reluctantly, perhaps sensing that cooperation might bring her closer to freedom. We played a soft audio recording of her fiancé's voice, retrieved from a voicemail, while she was hooked to continuous monitoring. Within 90 seconds, tears began to form, first clear, then darkening rapidly. The real-time lab feed showed a sharp spike in both catecholamines and inflammatory cytokines in her bloodstream, within seconds of the emotional trigger. The cytokine surge seemed to precede the ferritin rise, meaning inflammation was the first domino to fall. If we could dampen that initial inflammatory storm, we might stop the cascade before it reached the capillaries. This revelation gave us a possible treatment target. I discussed anti-inflammatory options with the hematology team, specifically corticosteroids for rapid cytokine suppression, though the risk profile concerned me. Emily, however, surprised us with her decisiveness. If it gives me a chance to stop crying blood, I'll try it. Her voice was firm, but her eyes still carried the weight of someone living on the edge of her own biology. We administered a low-dose IV corticosteroid under careful observation. For 6 hours, Emily remained tear-free, even when a nurse accidentally mentioned her fiancé's name. It was the longest she'd gone without an episode since admission. The relief was palpable, not just in her, but in the staff, who had been silently holding their breath every time they entered her room. That night, I stayed late, reviewing every data point from the past week. The patterns were clear: emotional triggers, inflammatory spike, vascular leakage, protein alteration, ferritin-rich tear film. The key was controlling the first 2 steps without sedating her into emotional numbness. If we could achieve that, there was a chance she could reclaim a semblance of normalcy without losing the capacity to grieve naturally. As I left the ward that night, I passed Emily's room. She was asleep, the silver locket resting on her chest, her face calm under the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. For the first time, her pillow was unstained. It was fragile progress, but it was progress nonetheless. What I didn't realize was that the next phase, the decision of how far to push this treatment, would test both her limits and mine in ways neither of us could anticipate. The morning after our corticosteroid trial, the team crowded into the conference room with coffees and guarded optimism. We had evidence that suppressing inflammation interrupted the cascade, but steroids were a blunt instrument. Immunosuppression, sleep disruption, mood swings, none of which Emily needed on top of grief. I wrote 3 columns on the whiteboard: inflammation, autonomic surge, tear film chemistry, and told everyone the plan had to address at least 2 pillars: without flattening who she was. Hematology argued for a cautious steroid taper paired with a non-steroidal anti-cytokine approach. Biologics were tempting but excessive for a tear disorder and risky without precedent. Neurology proposed low-dose propranolol to blunt adrenergic spikes. Psych recommended trauma-focused therapy and HRV biofeedback to teach her body a new baseline. Ophthalmology added something elegantly simple: lactoferrin-based drops to chelate iron in the tear film and N-acetylcysteine to break abnormal protein crosslinks, potentially reducing viscosity. None of these alone felt revolutionary, but together they formed a scaffold. We trialed the scaffold. I started Emily on a short dexamethasone taper, transitioning to the lowest effective oral dose, plus propranolol 10 milligrams 3 times daily, titrated by symptoms. Ophthalmology compounded lactoferrin drops and a low-dose N-acetylcysteine solution. Respiratory therapy fitted her with a wearable HRV monitor, and psych led daily 10-minute biofeedback sessions, ending with a brief, scripted exposure to a neutral memory of her fiancé, walking past a coffee shop they once liked, stopping well before the point of overwhelm. The first day was promising, the second was mixed. By day 3, the episodes returned, fewer and shorter, but still thick and dark when they came. The lab confirmed ferritin fell after drops, catecholamines blunted with propranolol, and cytokines dipped with steroids, yet the triad reassembled whenever a strong emotional cue broke through. "We're treating the fire," the neurologist said, "not the match." He was right. The system kept reigniting because her sympathetic loop, shock, memory surge, remained intact. That's when he suggested something I'd only seen in trauma literature: an ultrasound-guided stellate ganglion block, SGB. It's used off-label to modulate sympathetic outflow in refractory PTSD and certain pain syndromes. The idea was audacious: interrupt the sympathetic traffic jam at the cervical chain to soften the tidal wave that preceded every cytokine spike. Risks included transient Horner syndrome, inadvertent vascular injection, hoarseness, and the unpredictable ethics of dampening grief via nerve block. Medicine loves mechanisms. Grief does not. I took a long walk before discussing it with Emily. She deserved more than a consent form. She deserved clarity. In her room, I explained the physiology in plain language. Your body is firing the alarm too hard and too fast. This block briefly quiets the alarm center so your system can relearn calm. It won't erase memories. It won't erase him. But it may give your biology a pause long enough for everything else we're doing to finally stick. "Always." She listened, thumb circling the dent in her locket, then asked the question I'd been asking myself. If I stop crying blood, am I just numbing what I feel? I told her the truth. We're aiming to change the volume of the siren, not the meaning of the loss. We convened an ethics consult. The committee pushed us, in a good way, on reversibility, intent, alternatives, and publication boundaries. We documented that SGB is temporary, repeatable only with explicit consent, and paired with active psychotherapy to honor, not mute, grief. We agreed not to solicit media or publish without her future approval, and to treat this as care, not experiment. Emily requested one night to decide. In the morning, she said yes. I need my body to stop screaming so I can actually hear my heart. Under ultrasound guidance, anesthesia advanced a needle to the right stellate ganglion at C6 and injected local anesthetic. I stood at her shoulder, watching the monitor and her face. Within minutes, her right eyelid drooped slightly, expected Horner's, and the warmth in her cheek spread. Her heart rate eased from 94 to 72, so we dimmed the lights and waited. For the first half hour, she felt nothing dramatic. Then we ran the mild exposure protocol, a neutral song from their road trip playlist at low volume. Moisture gathered at the lid margin, as it always did, but the droplets remained clear, no darkening, no thickness. On the live feed, catecholamines nudged up, but cytokines barely moved. The next 24 hours were the quietest of her hospitalization. We maintained propranolol, continued the eye drops, and halved the steroid dose. Psych lengthened HRV sessions and introduced a grounding script she helped write, language that felt like hers, not ours. Twice, unexpected triggers arrived: a condolence text and a hallway conversation that drifted into her room, and both times her eyes watered without turning red. The lab reported ferritin near normal in the tear film. For the first time, our pillars were holding together. The autonomics calmed, inflammation didn't crest, and the tear chemistry failed to assemble its dark lattice. On day 2 post-block, we walked to the family lounge at sunrise. She wore her own sweater, hair loosely tied back, the locket steady against her sternum. "I'm still sad," she said, looking out at the parking lot blinking awake, "but it doesn't feel like drowning." I told her sadness wasn't our enemy. Physiology without breaks was. Our next decisions would be about durability, whether to repeat SGB, how to taper meds, and how to rebuild her life around rituals that honored love without re-injuring biology. We had nudged a boundary that felt both medical and moral. Now came the hardest part: helping her keep what we'd gained without losing what mattered. The days following the stellate ganglion block felt like stepping into a new chapter, not only for Emily, but for the entire team. The atmosphere in her room shifted. The tension that had once hung in the air, making every nurse hesitant to speak, was replaced by something quieter, gentler. Her eyes still watered when she spoke about her fiancé, but the tears remained clear. There was no thick crimson streak running down her cheek, no dark stain on the pillow when she woke. It was a fragile piece, but we all knew it was worth protecting. We kept her on propranolol and the lactoferrin N-acetylcysteine eye drops, slowly tapering the steroids to 0 over a week. Lab tests showed her ferritin levels and tear fluid had stabilized. Her cytokine markers were back within normal range, and the abnormal protein chains were now undetectable. Her hemoglobin levels also began to climb, indicating that whatever blood loss had been occurring through her tears had ceased entirely. Emily's physical recovery was mirrored by subtle shifts in her demeanor. She began walking the ward corridors without her shoulders hunched. She spoke more, laughed occasionally, and even accepted visits from friends she had been avoiding since the accident. Still, the silver locket rarely left her hand. It had become less a crutch and more a deliberate keepsake, something she held with intention rather than desperation. One afternoon, she joined me for coffee in the hospital's small rooftop garden. The winter air was sharp, the sky pale and stretched thin over the city. "It's strange," she said. "I feel like I can finally cry for him without my body betraying me." I told her that grief will always have a language, but now hers wasn't written in blood. She smiled faintly, and I realized this was the first time I'd seen her smile without it collapsing into pain. In physical therapy, she began integrating mindfulness-based breathing exercises with light movement. HRV readings improved week by week, showing that her autonomic system was no longer in a constant fight-or-flight state. The neurologist suggested we might never need to repeat the stellate ganglion block if she could maintain this stability, though we agreed to keep it as an option should severe episodes return. The day before her discharge, Emily asked to see all her lab results. She studied them silently, her finger tracing the line graphs that mapped her ferritin and cytokine levels over the past month. "I needed to see it," she said, "proof that it's not just in my head, even though it started there in a way." I reminded her that the mind and body aren't separate worlds. They're neighbors sharing a wall, and sometimes one's earthquake rattles the other. We arranged for outpatient follow-ups with hematology, neurology, and psychiatry. I also recommended she join a trauma support group, not because she was broken, but because she had lived through something extraordinary and isolating. She nodded, saying, "Maybe it'll help if I can tell my story before it becomes just a headline in my mind." That was when I understood she was beginning to frame her experience not as a horror, but as a chapter in her life she could own. On the morning of her release, Emily wore her own clothes for the first time in weeks. A deep green sweater and dark jeans. The locket hung outside her sweater, catching the light. As we signed the final discharge papers, she looked at me and said, "I don't know if this will ever fully make sense, but I do know it doesn't have to define me anymore." It was the kind of sentence that feels like a closing paragraph, but also a beginning. Watching her walk through the hospital doors, I realized this case had altered me too. I had always believed in the limits of medicine as dictated by textbooks, but Emily's journey had shown me the spaces between those pages, the ways biology bends to emotion, and how healing sometimes demands both science and humanity in equal measure. Her tears had taught me something profound. The body will tell its truth, but with care, it can learn to tell it differently. That night I updated her chart for the last time. Condition stable, symptoms resolved, patient discharged without patient plan. But in the private notes I kept for myself, I wrote something else. Emily Harrow's grief rewrote her biology. Together, we rewrote it back. Emily's case remains one of the most profound experiences of my career, not because of the rarity of her condition, but because of what it revealed about the fragile bridge between mind and body. Her tears were not simply a medical anomaly, they were a language of grief so intense that it transformed her biology. In the end, it wasn't a single treatment that saved her, but the delicate weaving together of medicine, psychology, and trust. Today, Emily lives quietly, continuing her follow-up care and slowly reclaiming the parts of her life that grief had stolen. She still misses him, she always will, but she now carries that loss without her body punishing her for it. Her story reminds me that healing is rarely about erasing pain. It's about learning to live alongside it without letting it consume everything. Sometimes, the most extraordinary recoveries aren't loud or miraculous. They're the quiet moments when someone finally breathes freely again. If Emily's journey moved you, stay with us. There are more stories, more lives forever changed by the unexpected intersections of human emotion and medical mystery. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for the next case that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the human body.